Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. The election of Donald Trump has brought many dramatic changes in society south of the border, with anti-immigrant policies leading to ICE raids and deportations, the DOGE cuts to U.S. aid and other institutions, his so-called anti-woke policies against DEI, with many major corporations and educational institutions in the United States rolling back their DEI policies and programs for fear of retribution from the Trump administration. Some of that has seemingly already seeped over the border into Canada, with top sponsors of the nonprofit Pride Toronto, with well-known brands Google, Home Depot, Nissan, and Clorox pulling out of their sponsorships. We wondered if there were other impacts on Canada's nonprofit sector that we should be keeping a close eye on. To help us unpack some of the latest developments, please welcome Mante Molepo, the founder and CEO of Mante Molepo Consulting, where she advises nonprofits on board governance and organizational diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mante has spent over 20 years working within the nonprofit sector, from settlement organizations to legal, healthcare, and educational institutions. As an award-winning leader, Mante serves on the board of governors of the Ottawa Hospital, the Residence Corporation, as well as a national women's legal organization. She's a founding member and former chair of Parents for Diversity, a former representative of the Ontario Bar Association Council, and a former director of the Amnesty International Canada, Equitable, and the Parkdale Food Centre. Welcome to the podcast, Mante.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, under President Donald Trump's administration, we've seen significant rollbacks on DEI programs in the States. From your perspective, how are these developments influencing the nonprofit sector here in Canada? Have you noticed anything?
It's interesting. I see a variation. I see organizations, nonprofits, retreating from their DEI efforts, and they're using the executive orders as an excuse to abandon their DEI commitments. Others are also remaining steadfast and really doubling down on their commitments. But we're also seeing, and I see this a bit more, of rebranding their DEI efforts, or developing what are like shadow DEI initiatives, where they no longer refer to, controversial, quote unquote, controversial language around DEI. And so they're packaging it up as, accessibility or belonging or human capital. And I can understand why this is happening, but I think it leads to a lack of transparency, which can be problematic because it does undermine accountability. And there are real world implications. You referred earlier to Pride Toronto in February. It announced its critical sponsors like Google and Home Depot and others withdrawing support. And the executive director of Pride Toronto, Kojo Modeste, saying that he said that it was a direct connection between the policies of what's happening in the White House and these organizations pulling out of their sponsorship. So that in itself is problematic. But I also kind of want to highlight the economic impact. We need to really evaluate the benefits and the economic contributions that events like Pride Toronto bring to our economy. The 2023 Pride Festival's contribution to the GDP increased to over $589 million, and generated combined tax revenues of over $231 million, and not to mention the thousands of jobs that were created. So what are those economic impacts or other impacts of withdrawing DEI measures or having these pushbacks? And we saw that also. I know this is in the context of the corporate sector, but Target, it had a decline in its first quarter sales, which was also the result of people, the backlash to the backlash. And so, the boycotts to Target led to a decrease in sales. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But also for me, what is really important is that our legal landscape is very different from the United States. Unlike the US, in Canada, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects affirmative action. Substantive equality, which is a constitutional principle here in Canada under the Constitution, is really critical, and it enables governments to take action to combat discrimination proactively through affirmative action programs. And the Charter specifically refers to affirmative action programs. We also have human rights legislation, such as Ontario's Human Rights Code, as well as pay equity laws and employment equity legislation that explicitly support, the creation of ameliorative programs that are aimed at addressing the disadvantages that people face as a result of, their gender, their race, their disability, sexual orientation, and other protected grounds. So it's important to keep that in mind. Here in Canada, things are different.
Yeah, we are different. We should embrace that for sure. And I guess what I'm curious about is what specific DEI related challenges are your Canadian clients grappling with as the result of this sort of shifting North American landscape? Are you seeing some, without infringing on any confidentiality, are you seeing some examples you could provide us?
I think there are three challenges in particular that stand out to me, that I see generally across the board. The first I would say is like just the internal resistance that organizations are getting from maybe boards and senior leaders, especially when DI is framed as some kind of ideological issue or problem instead of it being strategic and a value add. And so these organizations are really losing sight of the value of DI and what it can bring to the organization. We know that it increases performance, innovation, makes organizations more competitive if we have not just diversity, but we have equity and inclusion as well. People feel safe and that they can be authentic within their organizations. It also mitigates risk, especially around claims of harassment and discrimination. If we have organizations that are being proactive through DI initiatives to minimize these risks, then they can also mitigate, legal and reputational risks over the long run. And then I think it's just important for attracting talent. We see how millennials and Gen Zs, but I would say across different age groups, employees are really increasingly making DEI something that's non-negotiable. We see research from Glassdoor that shows that 76% of these millennials and Gen Z workers or job seekers are, they consider a company's DEI efforts or an organization's DEI efforts before accepting a job offer, or that they would consider. Other research finds that, these age groups would reconsider leaving an organization if their employee is rolling back on DEI initiatives. And I also think just from a strategic revenue generating approach, it does attract funding and strengthens philanthropy. So I think that is, for me, the first piece. I think the second is resistance from employees, stakeholders, volunteers, donors across the sector who think, DEI is being reduced to some kind of zero-sum situation, or that it's leading to DEI initiatives DEI hires. So this is a very genuine concern that I see across the nonprofit or across society at large, that, people feel that their fear, especially people, this backlash, I would say, to DEI is driven a lot by people with dominant identities, that giving opportunities to historically disadvantaged communities takes away from people's opportunities. So thinking, for example, if we're introducing measures to promote more women into executive positions, that means less men will have these opportunities. And that leads to that concern that many have against DI, that it's leading to the recruitment of unqualified people, which is patently untrue. And again, it reflects much of what is being expressed south of the border, but also amongst people here in Canada. And so there's this idea that we hire based on merit, and hiring, Indigenous and equity deserving people is going to lead us to hiring people who are less qualified. And this myth of meritocracy, I think, is something that is very, very much ingrained in people's mindsets, but it also ignores the systemic barriers that many Indigenous and equity deserving people face in applying for jobs and being promoted into positions, including, into positions like board governance. Whether it's because they're foreign trained, even though they have been licensed to practice in Canada, whether it's their accents, their disabilities, their gender identities. And so these are real issues that organizations are grappling with. And then I would say the third thing is like just the lack of alignment between DEI commitments and governance structures. Many organizations, especially over the past 5 years, have issued, public statements about, anti-Black racism in the wake of George Floyd, or anti-Asian racism as a result of the pandemic. But really not taking the steps to fully integrate DEI into their organizations. They've published these statements, but they have, for instance, no evaluation frameworks, metrics to measure and report on progress, or even to develop programs or policies around DEI. Or when they do, they don't really allocate resources, whether it's financial or human resources, to doing this work. And that requires, like anything else, resources and investment. So they do, we've seen also how they've kind of done a lot of work to recruit, let's say, their first Indigenous or equity deserving board member or CEO. But they didn't really focus on cultivating an environment, a culture where these people can feel safe, where they're treated equitably, and where there's a sense of inclusion. And this has led to very public resignations and damage to organizations' reputations. We saw that with Nika Allen and other directors, from the Association of Fundraising Professionals, which again highlights the problem nonprofits face when they don't properly address DEI. So while this happened, prior to the second Trump administration executive orders, I think I have observed that things are getting worse over the past year when organizations don't take meaningful steps to address these issues effectively.
So it's a performative kind of PR initiative rather than actually addressing it in a more systemic and a real cultural shift within the organizations.
Exactly. Yes.
Many Canadian nonprofits receive funding from US-based or multinational corporations, as you know, and we were just talking about Pride Toronto. Are you seeing examples where funders are placing limits or conditions on DEI programming? If so, how are organizations responding? What is your insight into that?
Yeah, I do see there's kind of some pressure, and some organizations worry that visible DEI efforts or initiatives will alienate donors or community members, especially in our increasingly polarized society. But I often, and this is the advice I often give to my clients, is, what have you done to assess the risk of not pursuing these measures? People trust that when they work for an organization that is committed to DEI, it's going to follow through on its commitments, and then pulling back can really alienate not just employees, but board members and other stakeholders, whether they're volunteers or donors. So I really think that it's important for organizations to really do a risk assessment and also manage that risk effectively. We're not navigating or living in a world that is equitable and inclusive. We know that, including within the nonprofit sector, that there's a lot of inequality, and whether it's within, the leaders that run our organizations, or the people that volunteer for us, or even the communities that we're serving. So I think it's really important organizations think critically about how they want to steward this work, and what are the risks that are going to be involved from pulling back because of some inflated concern that, if we continue this work, we can be highly effective.
I'm curious, so you talked about this off the top a little bit, but I'd like to double down on it and get perhaps a greater insight from you. Are some organizations downplaying or rebranding their DEI efforts to preserve corporate partnerships or to avoid controversy? What are the risks of this kind of strategic retreat? You mentioned you've seen that in some instances. I'd really like to explore the ramifications of that, and on the flip side, what would be more courageous? What would a more courageous approach look like, and what are the benefits of that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I definitely think some organizations are downplaying or rebranding their DEI efforts. to preserve corporate partnerships and also to avoid controversy, but they're not, again, I find these decisions are being made without conducting a full assessment of the risk, and also just how are we going to manage the risk once it's out there. So we do, and I talked about this earlier, these shadow DI initiatives. I think we're no longer referring to DI or ESG, but we're packaging it up in maybe not better, but more palatable language, like belonging or community or human capital. What I think is really important for us in Canada to remember is that many American organizations must comply with these executive orders. So they're really, in a way, required to rebrand their initiatives accordingly. So, for instance, they're, again, maybe they believe in the value of DI, but because of these orders, they have to rebrand. And an example that comes to mind is an American DI practitioner, Lily Zhang. They adopted a FAIR framework: fairness, access, inclusion, representation. Not so much, and they still refer to DI, but they are now guiding their work under this FAIR framework. These shifts are understandable in the context of the United States, but here in Canada, DEI is not illegal. We don't have legislation restricting it, and so we really need to think about DEI in the context of Canada. So what concerns me is that we are seeing some trends here in Canada kind of following what's happening in the US. At the beginning of January, University of Alberta, President Bill Flanagan stated that the university will replace equity, diversity, and inclusivity with a so-called new framework, a new language: access, community, and belonging. However, they said that they're not abandoning their DEI commitments. But I've spoken with many leaders in both the corporate and nonprofit sectors who tell me the same thing. They see the imperative for DEI and will continue to pursue it. They may not be doing it under the, specifically referencing DEI, but they remain committed to it. Again, I think it's really important to manage, to assess those risks of what happens if we don't act accordingly, if we retreat from our DEI commitments, if organizations, for instance, stop addressing discrimination and harassment, they expose themselves to human rights claims or other really public incidents that can really ruin an organization's reputation. So I think it's really important that organizations tie their DEI commitments to their values and incorporate into their strategies, their governance, and their operations, not just for the short or medium term, but for the long term. And sorry, I know you asked about a courageous approach. I think I often position this as, I ask my clients, what is it that you want to achieve? I think many organizations are unclear about what they want to do because they've never really clarified why DEI is important. They kind of latched onto it 5 years ago. They adopted DI language. You said it you really clearly that it's can be performative, but they didn't integrate DI into their strategy and across their organizations. So I think really that courageous leadership will require us to be transparent with our commitments, even when we're language is quote unquote shifting or there's this backlash. Being transparent about who we are as an organization. What are our values? How are we aligning them with our strategy and how we decide to move forward? And then embedding DEI into governance and operations, not just treating it as some kind of branding exercise, but making it foundational to how we function, how we make decisions, how we engage with stakeholders and allocate resources. I think that those are critical pieces.
Thank you for that. That was a very helpful answer, and it really gave us a spectrum of things to think about. We're in a moment of increasing polarization. It's quite obvious, not just south of the border, but here in Canada as well. How can nonprofits lead inclusive conversations on race, gender, and equity in a way that helps bridge this divide?
It's not easy. I think conversations around identity are increasingly polarizing. 5 years ago, with the murder of George Floyd, many Black people in communities finally felt, seen that they could engage in these conversations. And we saw similar movements of visibility with the rise in anti-Asian racism during the COVID-19 pandemic and during Canada's ongoing reconciliation with reckoning with truth and reconciliation with the unmarked graves at former residential schools. And I think we all know that these moments opened space for conversation, but they also triggered fear and defensiveness and backlash. And ultimately, I think people are just afraid to speak. They're afraid to say the wrong thing, being misunderstood, being publicly shamed. And we live in an era of social media where one mistake can destroy us. And so this cancel culture in which we exist is to our detriment. It doesn't allow us to engage in meaningful, authentic dialogue. And one of the most important courses, or popular courses I teach, is on how leaders can navigate difficult conversations on divisive issues. And I always start with this quote that I love from Margaret Wheatley, and she wrote that human conversation is the most ancient and easiest way to cultivate the conditions for change, personal change, community, and organizational change. And I think the first thing that nonprofits can do is to really focus on how can we cultivate the conditions for change through conversation. And one way we can do that is by cultivating psychological safety. This is, the belief that within a group, I feel that I can engage in interpersonal risk taking. I can speak up. I can share ideas. I can admit that I've made a mistake or have failed without that fear of being punished or rejected or embarrassed or canceled, So if we can hold space for people to share their concerns around DEI, to express their experience with being misgendered, to talk about the invisibility of having a disability and all of the ways in which we navigate the world. If we can create that space for people to share without that fear of being punished, I think we can really open up dialogue. But that doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable, right? And I think that we feel that if we create psychological safety, then we've opened up the space for people to say whatever they want when they want, and that's not how it can be done. So just keeping that in mind, I think is critical. And there are many ways I think leaders can reflect and model this behavior, and we can talk about that. I don't know if is part of what you wanted to chat about, but I'm happy to share.
Yeah, actually, I do want to talk about that. I want to understand from your perspective your advice to leaders and in terms of trying to foster that kind of a culture within their organization. And I was curious. I liked what you were talking about when you were saying, letting people speak about their experiences relating to diversity, their identity, and just listening and being courageous in these conversations. And I'm curious what advice you do have for leaders who are trying to not be performative and are trying to be proactive in developing and fostering that kind of a culture.
Yeah, it's not, again, I would say it's not something that's easy, I think, for leaders to do, because we've never, these are tools or competencies we've never been equipped with. So we've never really gone to school and learned how to have difficult conversations, unless, of course, we've taken specific courses on it. But I think there are 4 really important values that can help guide, that leaders can use to guide and navigate difficult conversations. And those are humility, curiosity, empathy, and compassion. I think when leaders adopt these values, they really create the conditions for people to speak honestly, to be heard, to remain engaged in the conversation, especially when things get uncomfortable. And in my work, I often say that conversations on divisive issues are not just interpersonal, but they have to be situated in a broader context, the organizational context and the societal context. So if organizations, listen to some voices, often those, let's say, belonging to dominant identities, while ignoring or silencing other voices, they run a huge risk of alienating their people. And we've seen examples of this across many nonprofit organizations. Earlier this year, the Advocate Society faced backlash after rescinding an invitation to Tariq Haddad, who's a Syrian refugee and entrepreneur, due to his social media comments on the conflict in Gaza. And this decision led to internal dissent, including the resignation of the incoming president and external criticism questioning the organization's values and commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And many members canceled their memberships to the Advocate Society. And I think that's a textbook case on the importance of listening and engaging in courageous conversations. It illustrates the need for nonprofits to adhere to those commitments. So if we say, we're committed, like the Advocate Society, it has its statements on DEI or on diversity, and where it says, we commit to fostering diversity and inclusiveness in the legal profession in Canada, including by identifying and addressing barriers to membership, barriers to participation by all members. If we mean that, then we have to live by those values. And so not consulting its members on how to respond to the concern about Mr. Haddad as a speaker, and just canceling the event didn't do it any good. And it just led to a very public backlash and a huge blow to its reputation and a lack of trust amongst its stakeholders. So I think what leaders need to do is really embed listening into decision making. So building consultation processes, for instance, before making such high stakes decisions, especially when they involve, things like identity or conflict or public engagement. And I'm not talking about, having a town hall, a one-off town hall, or, a survey. It's really creating structured, representative ways to hear from those people across your organization, so that we have a balanced approach and understanding of what people are feeling, and then we can respond accordingly. I think training leaders, like I said, many leaders are not equipped to engage in this dialogue, and then they just freeze, and then they say the wrong thing, and then that whole cycle of, oh, I'm afraid to speak, and the cancel culture really plays up to these concerns. And so equipping board members, senior leaders, managers with the skills to lead conversations that are values based and not reactive, and also learning to sit with discomfort, recognizing power dynamics and creating space for people to disagree in a way that is respectful without escalating the situation. And I can't emphasize this enough, but human conversation, this dialogue, is all about connection. We have more that unites us than divides us. And if we can focus on what brings us together, what our values, because we all have underlying values that are important to us. And we would be surprised that engaging in dialogue actually enables us to uncover what we have more in common than what is different and divisive.
Well, I appreciated what your comments were, because I think we've seen knee-jerk reactions on both sides of the, in the spectrum, for those who are defensive in the face of DEI programs and initiatives, who are from a dominant group, and then the reverse being true, as you say, cancel culture as well. And your advice to being open and listening and empathetic and respectful, it goes a long way to being able to sort of navigate these challenges and be able to see things through somebody else's perspective to enrich our own understanding. I'm curious now, when you look at the stages that we're finding ourselves in, do you believe that Canadian organizations are actually at risk of importing American cultural and political conflicts around DEI? And if so, how should leaders stay grounded in our own legal and cultural context while still being globally aware and engaged internationally? What are your thoughts around that?
There is. I don't think so. I think that I think that leaders should stay grounded in Canada's legal and cultural context, reinforced by our charter again, our employment equity laws, especially for federally regulated institutions, human rights codes. I mean, again, Canada's a different climate. So if I could be very frank, it's those organizations that have never been truly committed to DEI that are using what's happening south of the border to kind of escape their commitments or to weaken or water down their commitments around DEI. So I think it's really important that we remember who we are as a country. We recently had a federal election where we voted in a government that is committed to recognizing difference across our society and that champions, that believes in equality. And I think that's really critical. These are the values that we hold as a society. Much of the discourse on what is happening in the US, again, focuses on these executive orders and the backlash to DEI. However, I don't think we look at the broader context of like we kind of look at these executive orders and these measures that are coming into place, but we don't really push the analysis a bit further to really understand what are the ramifications of these executive orders. We've seen how qualified officials are being replaced with unqualified individuals. The very it's so inconsistent with what diversity, equity, and inclusion represent, and this idea that merit matters, and we're seeing the opposite happening. An example with the criticism of General Charles Q. Brown Jr., who served as the 21st chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was, accused of being some kind of diversity hire. Even though this is a highly qualified person, over 4 decades of military experience and being widely recognized as one of the most qualified leaders in that role. We're just seeing the retreat of so many important measures and the removal of highly qualified individuals. And we're not asking what is the impact of that. And I think we need to really turn the conversation to that impact. We see public institutions banning DEI related literature and curriculum in universities, in schools. What is the impact of that? How are we going to cultivate critical thinking, awareness about difference in our society? How are we going to be innovative? How are we going to learn to live together if we are, shaming a child's book because it's DEI related? So I think these are the conversations that we should really be focusing on, and also just nonprofits and companies who are championing DEI and remaining steadfast in their commitment, who are being, publicly named and shamed. But again, we need to switch that conversation to what the impact of that is, and we need to do that a little bit more than focusing on the problem with DEI.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we haven't yet seen all of the consequences, but some of them are pretty predictable, and we're very early in the scenario that's evolving in the United States, but some are pretty obvious. It is true, and I guess if you were going to look ahead, what's your advice to nonprofit leaders who are committed to equity and inclusion but are feeling pressure internally or externally to retreat or soften their stance? What would you tell them to do?
To really think about, again, goes back to the question I always ask my clients, and I know it sounds oversimplified, but what is it that you want to achieve? And if it's that things around psychological safety, creating an organization that's representative of the communities you serve, increasing revenue. If all of those things are important to you, then you need to remain committed to DEI. And so really staying grounded in your values as an organization, especially if you have commitments around DEI, if it's part of your strategy and how your board and your organization functions. And also staying grounded in your own context. here in Canada, I know I keep saying this quite a lot, but we do have our own legal, cultural, and policy frameworks here. Our charter that protects substantive equality, um, nonprofits operating within these human rights contexts, our commitments to truth and reconciliation, anti-racism, and accessibility. These are not just moral imperatives; they're legal obligations in many cases, but they're also just the right thing to do. And then to really clarify your purpose, why did we commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the first place? What outcomes were we trying to work towards achieving? If DEI was just, this checkbox exercise or this branding strategy, then yes, it will be very easy to walk away from it. But if it's really part of who you are as an organization, your vision, your mission, your values, your governance, then retreating it will come at a much larger cost because people have trusted you to lead this work. And then I think this is something we don't often talk about, but not confusing discomfort with risk. Not all discomfort is going to be like some kind of liability. Sometimes it's just a sign that your organization is confronting something that is difficult, hard truths. And so be able to create the capacity to manage this discomfort, navigate it collectively. And this is where consultations and engagement with stakeholders is really critical. When we listen to our people and we're guided by their insights, then I think we can build more resilient and stronger organizations. And then I would say, lastly, just lead and not follow. This backlash, you're right, it is very real, but so is the progress. We have to celebrate how far we've come, even over the past 5 years. And the most resilient organizations are the ones that are continuing to do this work, even in the face of this, whether they're facing, they're being innovative. If they get resistance from donors, they're finding other funding sources. They're not doing this work quietly. They're being vocal and they are calling it out, and they're engaging their communities and they're listening to their communities. And they're trying their best to navigate the polarization. And I think the most important thing that leaders are doing that I see is, we don't have all the answers. We are going to make mistakes, but we're willing to learn and be humble and curious in the process and hold ourselves accountable as we continue to do this work.
Well, Mante, thanks so much for your insights and advice for nonprofit leaders who may be struggling to navigate these challenging times while continuing to promote DEI within their own organizations and, I guess, stemming the tide of the influence of the United States on how we want to live our lives and how we want to run our organizations in Canada. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you, Mary, for having me. It was a pleasure to be here today.